A woman was fighting to keep 3 babies alive while her husband slipped a diamond ring onto another woman's finger. The scream ripped through St. Mary's Medical Center at exactly 1:14 a.m., sharp enough to freeze every nurse moving through the maternity ward. Charlotte Bennett gripped the hospital rails with trembling hands as another contraction tore through her exhausted body. Sweat dampened the loose strands of blonde hair stuck against her pale skin, while the fetal monitors beside her bed erupted into frantic beeping. 31 weeks pregnant with triplets and already battling a worsening heart condition, Charlotte could barely catch her breath between waves of pain. Outside the hospital windows, freezing January rain hammered against downtown Chicago in silver sheets, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of white and gold. Inside labor and delivery room 6, the air smelled like antiseptic, plastic tubing, and fear. Baby B's heart rate is dropping, Dr. Olivia Grant said, her calm voice tightening just enough to make the younger nurse glance up nervously. Charlotte heard the words, but struggled to process them. Everything around her felt underwater now. The fluorescent lights above her blurred together. The room tilted sideways for half a second before settling again. Her hand instinctively moved over the curve of her stomach as tears slipped silently down the side of her face. "Please," she whispered through shallow breaths. "Please don't let my babies die." Another contraction slammed into her before anyone could answer. Across town, 12 miles away from the hospital, cameras flashed beneath crystal chandeliers inside the Grand Marquette Hotel ballroom. Laughter echoed against marble walls while waiters carried champagne through crowds of Chicago's wealthiest elites. Nathaniel Bennett stood beneath soft golden lighting in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, one hand wrapped around a velvet ring box, while Vanessa Hale smiled beside him in a silver designer gown. She looked radiant under the cameras, polished and triumphant, her manicured fingers already reaching toward the massive diamond ring waiting inside the box. "You deserve the world," Vanessa whispered softly enough for nearby reporters to lean closer. Nate smiled for the cameras without hesitation. "And now you have it." Applause erupted around them as flashes exploded like tiny lightning strikes across the ballroom. A massive television screen behind the stage displayed the headline everyone would wake up talking about by morning. Bennett Industries CEO announces surprise engagement. Back at St. Mary's, one of the younger nurses glanced toward the muted television mounted high in the hospital corner while adjusting Charlotte's foreline. Her face suddenly drained of color. "Oh my God," she breathed before she could stop herself. Charlotte turned weakly toward the screen through half-open eyes. The image sharpened just enough for her to see Nate smiling beside Vanessa while reporters crowded around them. For one terrible second, even the pain seemed to disappear. Her entire body went still except for the trembling in her chest. The same man who once cried when they finally heard their baby's heartbeats was now sliding an engagement ring onto another woman's hand while Charlotte fought to survive alone. A sharp cry escaped her lips as another contraction hit harder than the last. The monitors screamed again. "We're losing baby B," someone shouted from across the room. Nurses moved faster now, shoes squeaking across polished floors while rain battered the windows harder outside. Charlotte could barely keep her eyes open anymore. But through the chaos, through the pain, through the sound of machines and thunder and distant voices, she kept staring at the television screen where her husband kissed another woman beneath a storm of camera flashes. 5 years earlier, Nathaniel Bennett used to wait outside fertility clinics holding Charlotte's hand like he was afraid the world might take her away from him. Back then, they were the couple people envied in Chicago society pages. He was the ambitious young CEO building Bennett Industries into a billion-dollar real estate empire, and Charlotte Bennett was the elegant former art history professor who somehow made cold luxury rooms feel warm just by standing inside them. Every magazine called them perfect. Every gala photographed them smiling beneath chandeliers. Nobody saw the years hidden underneath those polished photographs. 15 years of failed fertility treatments. 15 years of hormone injections, surgeries, sleepless nights, and quiet crying behind locked bathroom doors. Charlotte remembered every sterile waiting room. Every doctor carefully avoiding eye contact while explaining another failed procedure. Every baby shower invitation she pretended not to mind receiving. Through all of it, Nate always promised her they would survive together. "One day we will have our miracle," He used to whisper against her forehead whenever she broke apart in his arms. Then somehow, impossibly, the miracle finally happened. 3 heartbeats. 3 babies. 3 tiny lives flickering across a dark ultrasound screen, while Charlotte cried so hard she could barely breathe. Even Dr. Olivia Grant called it extraordinary. Charlotte still remembered Nate dropping to his knees beside the examination table with tears in his eyes after hearing the news. He kissed her stomach over and over again while laughing in disbelief. For a little while, she believed the worst years of their marriage were finally behind them. But miracles came with a cost. By the 20th week of pregnancy, Charlotte's heart condition had worsened dramatically. Walking across their penthouse left her breathless. Climbing stairs became impossible. Dr. Grant warned them repeatedly that carrying triplets placed enormous strain on Charlotte's already fragile heart valve. She needed rest, stability, less stress. Nate nodded during every appointment like the perfect husband. Then he started disappearing. First it was late meetings, then overnight business trips, then entire weekends spent saving the company from investors. Charlotte noticed the changes slowly, the way women often do when they desperately want to believe nothing is wrong. Nate stopped touching her stomach when the babies kicked. He stopped asking about nursery colors. He stopped coming to appointments. Some nights he barely looked at her at all. Instead, his attention drifted constantly toward his phone screen, toward messages that made him smile in ways Charlotte had not seen in years. Vanessa Hale entered their lives publicly 3 months later as Bennett Industries' new public relations director. Young, polished, camera-ready. She wore expensive perfume and sharp white suits, and somehow always managed to stand a little too close to Nate during charity events. Charlotte ignored the whispers at first. Rich men were always surrounded by beautiful women. Chicago tabloids invented stories every week. But one rainy November night, Charlotte woke up at 2:13 a.m. and realized Nate was not beside her in bed. The penthouse felt strangely cold without him. She found him downstairs in the private library speaking softly on the phone near the city windows. Charlotte only heard one sentence before everything inside her changed forever. "Once the babies are born," Nate said quietly, "everything becomes much easier." There was a pause. Then Vanessa's laughter crackled faintly through the speaker. Charlotte froze halfway down the staircase, one trembling hand gripping the marble railing while her babies shifted inside her stomach. The city lights blurred beyond the glass. Her chest tightened painfully as Nate lowered his voice again. "She is too weak to fight anything now." Charlotte stood there in silence long after the call ended. Somewhere far below, snow drifted across Michigan Avenue in soft white waves while the man she had loved for nearly 2 decades stared out over Chicago like she was already disappearing from his life. By December, Charlotte Bennett had stopped recognizing the woman staring back at her in the penthouse mirrors. Her cheeks had hollowed slightly beneath tired blue eyes, and every movement came slower now, careful and measured like her body understood something her heart still refused to accept. The doctors called it advanced valve deterioration. The tabloids called it pregnancy exhaustion whenever photographers caught her outside St. Mary's Medical Center wrapped in oversized wool coats beside security guards. But Charlotte knew the truth every time she climbed into bed alone while her husband stayed out until sunrise. Snow covered Chicago in thick, white layers the night. Charlotte overheard Vanessa again. Bennett Industries hosted its annual winter charity gala inside the Crown Regency Ballroom. All crystal chandeliers and black tuxedos and orchestra music drifting beneath ceilings painted gold. Charlotte had almost stayed home after Dr. Olivia Grant warned her blood pressure was becoming dangerously unstable. But Nate insisted her appearance mattered for investors. "Just smile for an hour," he told her while adjusting his cufflinks without looking up. "People need to see strength." Strength. Charlotte nearly laughed at the word. By the time the gala reached its final hour, her chest already ached from standing too long beneath hot ballroom lights, while strangers touched her arm and called her inspirational. Nate disappeared halfway through dinner, claiming he needed to take an important call. Charlotte watched him leave with Vanessa only seconds behind him, her silver dress flashing beneath the dim hallway lights like a signal flare. Something cold settled deep in Charlotte's stomach. She followed them quietly through the marble corridor beyond the ballroom, where the music faded into distant echoes. The private lounge door remained slightly open. Just enough. Charlotte stopped outside the doorway, one hand resting protectively against the curve of her stomach while the triplets shifted heavily inside her. Vanessa's voice floated through the crack first. Calm. Amused. Once she dies, the sympathy alone will triple your stock value. Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. Silence followed for 2 seconds. Then the unmistakable sound of ice clinking inside a whiskey glass. Nate exhaled slowly. Do not say it like that. Vanessa laughed softly. Why? It is true. Charlotte waited for him to deny it. To walk away. To defend her. Instead, Nate lowered his voice almost to a whisper. The trust transfers become easier after the babies are born. Charlotte stopped breathing. Her entire body went still beneath the weight of those words. Somewhere inside the ballroom, applause erupted faintly as another charity auction ended. But out here the world had narrowed into cold air and quiet betrayal. Vanessa moved closer to him. Charlotte could hear the soft scrape of heels against marble. You spent 20 years building this empire, Vanessa murmured. You really want a sick woman controlling half of it through those children? Nate did not answer immediately. That silence hurt more than anything else. Charlotte pressed her hand harder against her stomach as one of the babies kicked sharply beneath her ribs. Then another. Then another. Almost like they could feel her panic from inside her body. Tears blurred her vision while the massive diamond on her wedding ring caught the hallway light in cold white flashes. 20 years. 20 years reduced to whispered financial calculations behind a half-open door. Charlotte stepped backward carefully before they could see her standing there. Her breathing became shallow, uneven. Every instinct told her to run, but she could barely feel her legs beneath the weight of the pregnancy and the crushing realization settling inside her chest. By the time she reached the empty women's lounge down the corridor, her hands were shaking so violently she dropped her phone twice trying to unlock it. At exactly 2:13 in the morning, while snow fell silently across downtown Chicago and wealthy guests laughed beneath chandeliers downstairs, Charlotte Bennett made a call that would quietly change every remaining hour of Nathaniel Bennett's life. Abigail, she whispered the second the attorney answered. I need you to help me protect my children before my husband destroys everything. The first thing Abigail Pierce said after opening Charlotte Bennett's files was, Your husband has already started preparing for your death. Snow pressed against the tall windows of Abigail's downtown law office, while Chicago traffic crawled 20 stories below them in icy silence. Charlotte sat wrapped in a cream cashmere coat beside the conference table, both hands resting protectively over her stomach while the triplets shifted heavily beneath her ribs. She looked exhausted now, pale, fragile, but behind the exhaustion, something else had appeared in her eyes over the last 48 hours. Clarity. Abigail spread financial documents across the polished oak table one page at a time. Hidden trust transfers, offshore holding accounts, quiet property purchases under shell corporations. Nathaniel Bennett had spent months moving money where Charlotte would never think to look. He is protecting himself, Abigail said carefully, and preparing to question your mental competency after delivery. Charlotte stared down at the paperwork without blinking. Mental competency? Abigail slid another document toward her. A private physician evaluation request signed by Nate's legal team. They plan to argue severe emotional instability caused by a high-risk pregnancy and cardiac stress. If successful, they could limit your control over the children's inheritance trusts. For several seconds, the only sound inside the office came from the soft ticking of the antique brass clock mounted beside the bookshelf. Charlotte felt one of the babies kick sharply beneath her hand. Then another. Tiny reminders that 3 lives depended entirely on her staying calm. Staying smart. He thinks I am dying, she whispered quietly. Abigail did not answer immediately. That silence was answer enough. Outside, freezing rain began tapping against the windows in uneven bursts while Charlotte slowly removed her wedding ring and placed it on top of the documents. The diamond caught the office light in cold white flashes. Then we prepare before he realizes I know everything, she said. That was the moment Abigail stopped seeing a frightened pregnant woman and started seeing someone dangerous. Over the next week, Charlotte built what Abigail privately called a war package. Every morning she arrived carrying another folder tucked carefully inside oversized maternity coats while paparazzi waited outside St. Mary's Medical Center, hoping for photographs of Chicago's famous billionaire wife. Inside Abigail's office, Charlotte signed emergency trust revisions placing the triplets' inheritance beyond Nate's control if anything happened to her during childbirth. She authorized sealed DNA verification records to eliminate any future legal disputes over the babies. She recorded private video statements describing her wishes in case of medical complications. "If my children grow up without me," Charlotte said softly into the camera one snowy afternoon, "I want them to know they were loved before they even took their first breath." Even Abigail had to look away after that. But the most devastating discovery came late Thursday evening. Abigail entered the conference room carrying a thin black folder with an expression that instantly changed the temperature in the room. "You need to see this." Charlotte opened the folder slowly. Inside sat copies of internal Bennett Industries emails discussing leadership transition plans in the event of unexpected maternal loss. Vanessa Hale's name appeared repeatedly throughout the correspondence. So did projected stock increases tied to public sympathy coverage. Charlotte felt nausea rise instantly into her throat. Not because she was shocked anymore, because she realized how long they had been planning around her absence like she was already gone. "There is one more thing," Abigail said quietly. "Judge Eleanor Whitmore reviewed part of your emergency filing personally this morning." Charlotte looked up sharply. Everyone in Chicago knew Judge Whitmore. Brilliant. Ruthless. Impossible to manipulate. Why would she involve herself? Abigail hesitated before answering. "Because your father funded her law scholarship 30 years ago." Charlotte froze. She had not heard her late father's name spoken out loud in almost a year. "Your father once saved her career," Abigail continued softly. "And now she believes someone may be trying to take advantage of a dying woman." The room suddenly tilted sideways. Charlotte reached instinctively for the edge of the table as sharp pressure tightened across her chest. One breath, then another. The babies shifted violently beneath her ribs while black spots flickered across her vision. "Charlotte." Abigail stood immediately. "I am fine," Charlotte whispered, though her voice barely sounded human anymore. But the second she tried standing, the world disappeared beneath her feet. The storm arrived over Chicago just after midnight, turning the skyline into a blur of freezing rain and flashing ambulance lights. Inside St. Mary's Medical Center, Charlotte Bennett lay curled against stiff white sheets while another contraction ripped through her body hard enough to steal the air from her lungs. The monitors beside her bed pulsed in frantic, uneven rhythms, green lines jumping sharply across black screens while nurses moved faster with every passing minute. 31 weeks. The triplets were not supposed to arrive this early. Dr. Olivia Grant stood near the foot of the bed reviewing scans under harsh fluorescent lights, her calm expression growing tighter every few seconds. "Her blood pressure is climbing again," one nurse whispered, "and baby B is showing signs of distress." Charlotte barely heard them anymore. Sweat dampened her hospital gown despite the freezing cold. She could not stop feeling deep in her bones. Her fingers trembled against the blanket while rain hammered violently against the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Somewhere beyond those storm clouds, the city kept moving. Restaurants stayed open. Music played. People laughed. Meanwhile, Charlotte felt like the entire world had narrowed into pain, machines, and the sound of her own struggling heartbeat. "Where is my husband?" a young nurse asked quietly while adjusting Charlotte's oxygen line. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, another nurse glanced awkwardly toward the muted television mounted high in the corner of the room. Every screen inside the hospital seemed locked onto the same breaking entertainment story. Nathaniel Bennett's surprise engagement gala had officially gone public less than an hour earlier. Camera flashes exploded across the ballroom, while Vanessa Hale stood smiling beside him beneath crystal chandeliers in a silver gown that reflected light like shattered glass. Charlotte turned weakly toward the screen just as Nate lifted Vanessa's hand and slid the massive diamond ring onto her finger. Applause erupted through the ballroom footage, even with the volume muted. Champagne glasses lifted around them while reporters crowded closer. Vanessa leaned into Nate, smiling like she had already won everything Charlotte was about to lose. "Push update to all social feeds immediately," one reporter's voice read across the closed captions beneath the broadcast. "Chicago billionaire celebrates new beginning." Charlotte stared at the television in silence while another contraction seized her entire body. A soft cry escaped her lips before she could stop it. Dr. Grant moved closer instantly. "Charlotte, stay with me," she said firmly. "I need you breathing slowly for the babies." Babies. 3 tiny lives depending entirely on a woman whose own heart was beginning to fail under the strain. Charlotte squeezed her eyes shut while tears slid across her temples into her hairline. She remembered Nate crying the day they first heard the triplets' heartbeats. She remembered him painting the nursery walls himself at 3 in the morning because he wanted everything perfect before they arrived. She remembered believing him. The monitors suddenly shrieked louder than before. Nurses rushed toward the bed at once. "We are losing baby B again," someone shouted. Dr. Grant's face hardened instantly. "Prepare the operating room now." Thunder cracked outside so violently the hospital windows rattled. Across town, champagne continued pouring beneath gold chandeliers while cameras captured Nate and Vanessa laughing beside a towering engagement cake decorated with white roses and silver sugar crystals. One guest raised a toast while reporters scribbled headlines. "To new beginnings," the man announced proudly. At the exact same moment inside St. Mary's Medical Center, Charlotte Bennett gripped the hospital rails with shaking hands and whispered something almost too quiet for anyone to hear. "If I do not survive this," she breathed unevenly, "promise me my children stay away from him." Dr. Grant looked down at her for one long second before answering softly. "You are going to tell them that yourself." But the fear inside the room had already changed. Everyone could feel it now. Even the storm outside seemed to know something terrible was coming. At 3:42 in the morning, a 23-second hospital video quietly escaped onto the internet and changed everything. The recording was never supposed to leave St. Mary's Medical Center. A young night nurse had only been trying to update another staff member during the chaos inside labor and delivery when her phone accidentally captured the television mounted above Charlotte Bennett's hospital bed. On one side of the screen, Charlotte lay exhausted beneath harsh fluorescent lights while doctors rushed around her shouting medical updates over the sound of storm winds rattling the windows. On the other side, reflected through the television broadcast behind her bed, Nathaniel Bennett stood beneath crystal chandeliers, smiling beside Vanessa Hale as reporters applauded their engagement announcement. The contrast was so brutal it barely looked real. One woman fighting to keep 3 premature babies alive. One billionaire celebrating a replacement before the marriage had even ended. Within 20 minutes, someone uploaded the clip anonymously to social media with a single caption: "Chicago CEO abandons dying pregnant wife while proposing to mistress." By sunrise, more than 18 million people had watched the footage. News anchors called it the most disturbing viral scandal of the year. Morning radio hosts replayed the clip between shocked commentary. Hashtags flooded every platform. Hashtag Charlotte Bennett. Hashtag triplet scandal. Hashtag Bennett betrayal. Outside St. Mary's Medical Center, satellite news trucks lined the freezing sidewalks before dawn while reporters stood beneath umbrellas delivering live coverage into cameras. Public outrage is growing this morning against Bennett Industries CEO Nathaniel Bennett after footage surfaced overnight showing his critically ill wife in labor while he attended an engagement celebration across town. One anchor announced as snow mixed with freezing rain behind her. Inside the hospital, Charlotte knew none of it yet. She drifted in and out of exhaustion while doctors worked frantically around her. One baby had already been moved into emergency neonatal care. Another monitor kept alarming every few minutes. Dr. Olivia Grant had not sat down in over 6 hours. "We need to move faster," she told the surgical team quietly. Charlotte's heart cannot sustain this much longer. Meanwhile, 12 miles away, panic finally entered the ballroom for the first time that night. Nathaniel Bennett stood frozen near the champagne tower, staring at his vibrating phone while executives whispered urgently around him. Every major financial outlet in the country had picked up the story within hours. Bennett Industries stock had already dropped 11% before opening bell predictions even finalized. Investors were demanding statements. Sponsors began pulling charity partnerships live on camera. One board member left the gala entirely after reporters surrounded him outside the ballroom entrance shouting questions about corporate ethics and executive misconduct. Vanessa Hale's polished smile finally cracked the moment she opened social media on her phone and saw millions of strangers calling her a homewrecker beside screenshots of Charlotte lying in a hospital bed. "Fix this," she hissed under her breath while gripping Nate's arm hard enough to wrinkle his tuxedo sleeve. But there was no fixing it anymore. Because the public had seen something raw and undeniable. Not contracts. Not rumors. Not tabloid gossip. They saw a pregnant woman alone during the worst night of her life, while her husband smiled beneath chandeliers holding another woman's hand. And America hated men like that. Across the ballroom, Nate's private attorney forced his way through the crowd, holding a phone pressed tightly against his chest. His face had gone completely pale. "Nathaniel," he said quietly enough that only Nate could hear him. "You need to leave immediately." Nate glanced toward the cameras still flashing around the ballroom. "What now?" The attorney swallowed once before answering. "Judge Eleanor Whitmore has personally requested your presence at emergency family court this morning." For the first time all night, Nathaniel Bennett stopped looking like a billionaire in control of his empire. He looked like a man realizing the ground beneath him was beginning to collapse. The courthouse steps outside Cook County Family Court looked more like the scene of a political scandal than an emergency custody hearing. Reporters crowded behind steel barricades wrapped in winter coats, while camera flashes exploded through the gray Chicago morning. Snow drifted sideways beneath brutal January wind as news anchors repeated the same headline over and over again. Nathaniel Bennett arrives for emergency court appearance after viral hospital scandal. Black SUVs pulled up one after another beneath the courthouse awning while security officers struggled to control the growing crowd. Then Charlotte Bennett appeared. A hush moved through the reporters almost instantly. She sat weakly in a wheelchair wrapped in a pale wool coat with a hospital blanket draped across her knees. Her blonde hair hung loosely around her exhausted face, and the bruised shadows beneath her eyes made her look years older than she had 1 week earlier. But despite the exhaustion, despite the oxygen tube resting beneath her nose, Charlotte still held herself with quiet dignity as Abigail Pierce guided her carefully through the courthouse entrance. "Charlotte, how are the babies?" someone shouted from behind the barricades. Charlotte paused only once. Her voice came soft but steady. "They are alive. That is all that matters." Inside courtroom 4B, the tension felt suffocating. The old wood benches creaked beneath reporters and attorneys while television crews filled every available corner allowed by the judge's emergency media order. Nathaniel Bennett entered 10 minutes later wearing the same black tuxedo from the engagement gala beneath a dark overcoat, hastily thrown over his shoulders. The exhaustion in his face could not hide the panic settling into his expression now. Vanessa Hale followed close behind him in a cream designer coat, though the massive diamond engagement ring that had dominated headlines overnight was suddenly missing from her hand. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered precisely at 9 a.m. The entire room rose immediately. At 63 years old, Judge Whitmore carried herself with the cold precision of someone who had spent decades destroying powerful men who underestimated her. Her silver hair remained perfectly pinned despite the storm outside, and her sharp gray eyes moved slowly across the courtroom before settling on Charlotte. "Mrs. Bennett," she said quietly, "I understand you were discharged against medical recommendation to attend today." Charlotte nodded weakly from the wheelchair. "My children needed protection immediately, Your Honor." Across the room, Nate shifted uncomfortably for the first time. Abigail Pierce stood smoothly beside Charlotte and began placing folders onto the evidence table one by one. Financial transfers, emergency trust documents, private communications. Then came the hospital video. The same 23-second clip already seen by millions across the country, played silently across the courtroom monitors while reporters scribbled notes furiously. Charlotte lying in labor beneath hospital lights. Nate smiling beside Vanessa beneath chandeliers. Even inside the courtroom, the contrast still felt unbearable to watch. Judge Whitmore's expression never changed. "Mr. Bennett," she said calmly once the video ended, "would you care to explain why your critically ill wife was unattended while you publicly announced an engagement to another woman?" Nate straightened slowly. "Your Honor, the situation has been misrepresented online. Charlotte and I were already privately separated." Abigail interrupted immediately. "Then perhaps Mr. Bennett can explain why he transferred marital assets into offshore accounts 48 hours before her emergency delivery." The room went silent. Vanessa turned sharply toward Nate for the first time all morning. Abigail continued without hesitation. "Or why internal company emails discussed projected stock gains in the event of Mrs. Bennett's death." Even the reporters stopped typing at that. Nate's attorney stood abruptly. Objection. Denied. Judge Whitmore answered instantly. Abigail placed one final folder onto the evidence table. Your Honor, before entering emergency labor, Mrs. Bennett established irrevocable trusts protecting her children's inheritance and medical authority. Judge Whitmore opened the file slowly. Then she looked directly at Nate. Which means, she said carefully, if Mrs. Bennett's condition worsens, you no longer control a single dollar connected to those children. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Nathaniel Bennett's composure completely cracked. And across the aisle, Vanessa Hale slowly realized the empire she thought she was marrying into might already be collapsing around both of them. By noon, the scandal had already crossed international headlines. Financial analysts called it one of the fastest public collapses in recent corporate history. Bennett Industries stock plunged another 19% before lunch, while furious investors demanded emergency board intervention. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered beneath freezing winds carrying signs with Charlotte Bennett's name written across cardboard in black marker. Some held flowers. Others carried printed screenshots from the viral hospital video that had already become impossible to escape online. America had chosen its villain, and Nathaniel Bennett could feel it happening in real time. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Nathaniel no longer looked like a billionaire defending his reputation. He looked like a man trying to stop water from pouring through cracks he could no longer control. Vanessa Hale sat rigid beside him, her perfectly polished appearance beginning to fracture beneath the pressure of nonstop camera flashes and whispered media speculation. She had stopped making eye contact with reporters over an hour ago. Abigail Pierce stood calmly before Judge Eleanor Whitmore, while another stack of documents appeared on the courtroom screens. Your Honor, Abigail said steadily, we have now verified through independent forensic accounting that several offshore transfers tied to Bennett Industries were routed temporarily through accounts connected to Ms. Vanessa Hale. Vanessa's head snapped upward instantly. What? The courtroom erupted into overlapping whispers. Nate turned toward Vanessa sharply for the first time that morning. Be quiet, he muttered under his breath. But Vanessa was already staring at the documents displayed across the courtroom monitors. Wire transfers. Shell corporations. Authorization signatures she barely recognized. You told me those were investment accounts, she whispered, her voice shaking now. Nate's silence answered faster than words could. Across the courtroom, Charlotte Bennett sat quietly in her wheelchair wrapped beneath a pale hospital blanket while snow drifted past the courthouse windows behind her. She looked exhausted beyond measure, but there was no triumph in her face. Only sadness. 20 years of marriage collapsing into public humiliation beneath fluorescent courtroom lights. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses slowly before speaking again. Mr. Bennett, this court is now referring several financial findings to federal investigators for immediate review. Nate's attorney stood abruptly. Your Honor, surely we can resolve this privately. Judge Whitmore's expression hardened instantly. A woman nearly died while carrying 3 children during what appears to be an active financial concealment scheme. There is nothing private about this anymore. Silence crashed through the courtroom. Even the reporters stopped typing. Then came the final blow. Abigail nodded toward the side courtroom door as a hospital representative entered carrying sealed documentation from St. Mary's Medical Center. DNA verification. Official birth records. Emergency neonatal authorization. Abigail placed the paperwork carefully before the judge. The triplets are confirmed as the sole legal heirs connected to the Bennett family trust structure, she announced clearly. And all protections established by Mrs. Bennett are now fully enforceable. Nate closed his eyes briefly, like someone physically struck by the weight of those words. Because he finally understood what Charlotte had done. While he chased appearances, she protected everything that truly mattered. The children, the inheritance, the future. Vanessa slowly removed the massive engagement ring from her finger beneath the courtroom lights. Her hand trembled visibly now. You used me, she whispered toward Nate, loud enough for nearby microphones to catch every word. Nate reached toward her instinctively. Vanessa, listen to me. But she stepped backward immediately. The diamond slipped from her fingers 1 second later and struck the marble courthouse floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom louder than anyone expected. Reporters surged forward instantly. Camera flashes exploded like lightning across the room, while the ring spun in slow circles across polished stone, before finally stopping beside Nate's shoes. No one moved to pick it up. Outside, snow continued falling over Chicago while financial news alerts spread across every major network in the country. Bennett Industries board members were already preparing emergency resignation statements. Federal investigators were requesting subpoenas. And somewhere upstairs inside St. Mary's Medical Center, 3 tiny premature babies slept beneath warm hospital lights, completely unaware that their mother had just dismantled a billion-dollar empire from a wheelchair. For months later, the first warm sunlight of spring spilled across the windows of St. Mary's Pediatric Center, while Charlotte Bennett stood quietly beside 3 bassinets lined up near the nursery glass. The storm that nearly destroyed her life had faded into headlines people no longer discussed at dinner parties, but traces of it still lingered everywhere if someone looked closely enough. Bennett Industries no longer belonged to Nathaniel Bennett. Federal investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and emergency board removals had shattered the company within weeks of the courtroom hearing. News anchors called it one of the most spectacular executive collapses in modern Chicago history. Vanessa Hale disappeared from public view entirely after testifying before financial investigators. Nathaniel himself had not appeared on camera in over 2 months. The last photograph ever published of him showed a tired man in a gray overcoat leaving a federal building alone while reporters shouted questions he refused to answer. But inside the nursery at St. Mary's, none of that mattered anymore. Charlotte adjusted the tiny knitted blanket wrapped around baby Claire, while soft lullaby music drifted through hidden ceiling speakers overhead. All 3 triplets had survived. Against every medical prediction. Against every terrifying night spent beneath fluorescent hospital lights and oxygen monitors and whispered conversations outside intensive care doors. Small miracles. That was what Dr. Olivia Grant called them every time she checked their progress. Claire yawned softly in her sleep, while baby Lily stretched one tiny hand toward the sunlight spilling through the glass. Beside them, baby James slept peacefully with his father's dark hair and Charlotte's quiet expression. Charlotte smiled faintly at that. Funny how children could inherit features from people without inheriting their failures. Her own health remained fragile. Some mornings, she still woke breathless and exhausted from the damage pregnancy placed on her heart. But she was alive. And for the first time in years, alive felt like enough. The nurse at the front desk looked up suddenly as the nursery doors opened behind Charlotte. Nathaniel Bennett stepped quietly into the hallway carrying no security detail, no attorneys, no cameras. Just a simple dark coat and exhaustion carved deep into his face. He looked thinner now, older somehow, like losing everything had stripped away the polished billionaire image he spent 20 years building. Charlotte did not speak immediately. Neither did he. For several seconds, the only sound between them came from the distant rhythm of nursery monitors and soft lullaby music echoing through the corridor. Nate finally looked through the glass toward the babies. His eyes settled on James first, then Claire, then Lily. 3 children he almost lost before even understanding what they truly meant. "They are beautiful," he said quietly. Charlotte folded her arms gently across her chest. "Yes, they are." Nate swallowed hard before speaking again. "I never wanted things to become," he stopped himself. Maybe because there were no words left large enough to explain what he had done. Charlotte watched him carefully. This man once ruled boardrooms filled with powerful people. Now he could barely hold eye contact with the woman he betrayed. "You love the idea of power more than the people who gave it to you," she said softly. Nate lowered his eyes toward the floor. Snow no longer covered Chicago outside the nursery windows. The city looked brighter now beneath pale April sunlight reflecting across glass towers and crowded streets below. Somewhere far away, another ambulance siren echoed faintly through downtown traffic before disappearing again. Life continuing. Always continuing. Nate looked at the babies. One final time before turning toward the hallway exit. He paused only once. "I really did love you, Charlotte." She believed he meant it. That was the tragedy of it all. Sometimes people destroy the only thing they truly love because they cannot recognize its value until everything else disappears. Charlotte waited until the elevator doors closed behind him before stepping closer to the nursery glass again. 3 tiny babies slept peacefully beneath warm afternoon light, while reflections from the city shimmered softly across the windows around them. Charlotte rested her hand gently against the glass and smiled through quiet tears no cameras would ever capture. Some men spend their entire lives chasing wealth, beauty, and applause from strangers, only to discover too late that loyalty was the rarest fortune they were ever offered.